Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 2024 Built Environment Conference. For those of us that haven't met before, my name is Ant Bird, and I'm Director of the Built Environment sector here in BSI Knowledge Solutions. It's my privilege this morning to welcome you all and to be your host for the first part of this morning's session. We're doing things slightly differently this year and are only running a single day conference with this, our health, safety and wellbeing session this morning, and a further session this afternoon looking at the Information Management Initiative and the UK BIM framework, which my colleague Dan Rossiter will lead. The reason for this is that we will be running a much larger, more interactive and wide-ranging global built environment event in Q1 next year, which will bring together all the relevant parts of BSI and the built environment sector, including standards, certification and assurance, and training. But more details of that will follow to you all shortly. So, back to today. Before we get into our presentations with our fantastic lineup of speakers, just a bit of housekeeping. Next slide, please. This is a listen-only webinar that is being recorded. Okay, so you can share it thereafter. We do welcome your questions. We've already had a number of questions from you all, but we'd welcome more during the speakers presenting, because we'll come together over two panel discussions. My session first up, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Ian Richardson. So we've got ample time to take your questions and answer them, so please keep them coming. If you simply click on the Q&A button in the side panel, you can post your question. Similarly, if you experience technical difficulties, please submit your issue via the Q&A function, and the team at BSI Events will help you out. As per normal, we've all got to do it, and we've got CPD coming up in terms of lodging our CPD with our relevant professional institutions. If you complete the feedback survey, we will send you a link to today's recording, both this morning session and to follow this afternoon session. And because this is a CPD registered course, please request the certificate as part of the feedback, and we'll get that sent to you as well. Okay, so back to today then. Let's get started. Next slide, please. Our agenda over the next couple of hours takes us through a number of areas. Straight after myself, I'll be handing over to Peter Capelhorn, who I'll introduce properly in a moment, where he'll give his usual state of the nation. A bit of a backward look and a bit of a forward look as to what is going on within our built environment sector. And it's fair to say there's an awful lot going on. We'll then hear from Dr. Hal Davis talking about beyond Grenfell and delivering safer buildings going forward. And then we'll come back in and undertake a panel discussion when we've got a good slug of 15 minutes to answer your questions. Thereafter, we'll be looking at competency, which will be led by Ian Richardson, and he'll be joined by Hannah Clark from the CPA, and the industry competence and building regulatory system will be covered by two of our building safety regulators. They too will then have a panel discussion therein, and with plenty of time to take your Q&A therein. So, next slide, please. No further ado, we'll have our first speaker. Our first speaker today is Peter Capelhorn, known to a great many of us. Peter is the Chief Executive of the Construction Products Association, having been promoted to lead the CPA back in May 2019. I can't believe it was that long ago, Peter. But before that, he was the Deputy Chief Exec and Policy Director lead. His work now focuses on engaging with policymakers and industry leaders to raise the profile of the product sector and the members' businesses, grow the market, and reduce regulatory risk. He's a chartered architect with more than 35 years' experience, and is particularly respected for his leadership across the wider construction industry in a number of national roles, not least the Construction Leadership Council. Peter is also a huge advocate of standards and continues to give his time so generously to BSI. He's been involved in committee activity, I think, for around, if not over 25 years, having previously served on BSI's top overarching committee, SPSC, and is our chairman of CB Naught, our top built environment strategy committee. Peter, thank you for all that you do for us, and now over to you.
And thank you very much. Can I just check you can see me okay? Is that all right?
Yeah, we can see you and we can hear you, Pete.
That's fabulous. All right. Okay. Thanks very much. So look, and thank you very much for that great introduction. It's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me along again to give you a roundup, as we say, across the state of the nation. Now, before I do, I don't think there's any doubt that there's probably a few people on the call that don't know me. So just want to say that that following that great introduction, my focus has always been from a built construction point of view. My previous career as an architect took me into looking really at how buildings are built, how regulations work, and that real drive, that focus continues with me today. But we do have a lot of issues which I'll come on to. Before I do that, I just want to give everybody a clear view in terms of the construction sector and the product sector. So the construction sector, broadly speaking, is around 9% of GDP. And the product sector is around 65 billion pounds to the economy, which is in money terms about a third of construction, employing something around 380,000 people across the UK in around 25,000 companies. So we are talking about a significant sector. And that sector continues to feed into the construction across the country, in infrastructure, in housing, and in all the buildings such as prisons, schools, hospitals, that are such a focus at the moment for the new government. And so it is crucial actually that we have a product sector and a construction sector that is working efficiently, that is joined up, that is ensuring that the top line objectives, and particularly buildings that perform, are delivered. And of course, core within that is the use of standards, is the adherence to standards, is standards that support the practical day-to-day operation, but also standards that ensure that we've got those core values that we saw sadly lacking in the Grenfell disaster. So let me just go through a few things before I move on to some substantive detail. We do have quite a few issues across construction at the moment, but before that we were rocked, like the rest of the country, by some significant problems. And I suppose I'd just quickly list those as the pandemic, Brexit, and then Grenfell. And they really affected construction in a very substantial way, but we've worked through them. But I think we have got to really focus on how those different big events have changed the construction industry as we know it. I would call those inflection points. They're points where at the time everybody knew where they were, and everybody reeled at what they were experiencing, and everybody can feel the effects even now and possibly even longer. And the reason I say that is because I've known quite a few over my career. And let me just pick out a few to give you some clarity on that point. My career started in the year that Summerland in the Isle of Man happened. And for those of you who don't remember it or don't know it, Summerland was a leisure facility, and there was a major fire, and the result of that, there were many casualties. It was a very bad moment in time because people had not focused on the clear issues of the building, and that was added to by a number of operational problems. So Summerland to me was a real moment in time to always remember. Equally, I would say in the same mode of talking about these things, there was a tower block in London called Ronan Point, which collapsed because the panelised concrete system actually couldn't take the force of a gas explosion on a high level floor, and a whole chunk of that building just fell apart like a pack of cards. Again, similar underlying characteristics, similar build up to the disaster. Fortunately, not as many casualties in that case. And then, of course, we will all be cognizant of 9/11 and the Twin Towers in New York. Now, that to me is an interesting point, because those buildings, as a young architect, the design of them was demonstrated across the industry as being a change of how you construct high-rise buildings. Obviously, the construction industry in the States is structured in a slightly different way, but what it demonstrated is that a terrorist attack, nonetheless, could seriously damage a building which many people thought was quite impossible, given the unique structure of those towers, and sadly, of course, a huge loss of life. So then we, if you like, take those examples from the past and move forward. And again, in recent history, I've mentioned, and I'll come back to referencing Grenfell because it is such an important issue. But on the build up to Grenfell, we had a number of significant fires in tower blocks. And featuring very highly on that list, of course, is Lakanal House. Now, analysis of all of those have showed that fundamentally we have not been focused on what we should have been doing. We have not been focused on competence, and the later session will clearly work through that. And when you look at these various inflection points, you look at the fact that there is a build-up, there is a creation of problems that just remain undiscussed, unconsidered, or literally just pushed to one side. And then what happens is a moment of criticality, where unfortunately all of those things unhinge. All of those things then come together to create the disaster that we see opening up in front of us. And so I think, we need really to learn from this. And we are at a moment in time, I think, in the construction industry in the UK, where we have done an enormous amount of work since Grenfell. We have looked at every aspect. We've had the publication of the public inquiry very recently, and many of us are still absorbing the issues and the reflections. But I do think from this point going forward, we ought to keep this under continuous review. It is not simply good enough to say we have got to change. We've got to change the level of competency. We have got to have better and clearer regulation. We've got to have government that is on the case. We've got to have an industry that builds buildings that perform. Yes, all that is totally necessary, and in many parts of that are underway. But what we also need is a continuous feedback loop, a continuous monitor of how we take things forward, how we achieve those continuous improvement, and those continuous issues need to be fed back all the time to make sure we don't slip off the road again, off the road of sensible operation. I wanted to, at this point, just touch on the health and well-being aspect of what we're talking about today, and I'm doing that because I think there are many parallels to be learned out of the way in which health and well-being has been tackled in UK construction. The recent sad passing of John Prescott, who many will remember as the Deputy Prime Minister, a very flamboyant politician, without doubt. The thing that I remember about John Prescott's time in high government is the 2001 Health and Safety Summit. Many of us were there. Many of us, of course, are a lot younger than today, but it was a seminal moment for UK construction. John Prescott decided that the amount of fatalities in the UK industry was far too high, and something needed to be done. He called the industry together at a meeting in London, and he gave the industry a significant challenge that fatalities and injuries needed to come down. And that was the real start of a move towards a much more considerate industry that did focus on health and safety. Now, that was in parallel of all the work that had been going on with CDM, but I think it is fair to say that CDM had not really taken hold until the Prescott Summit. And since then, we have had several iterations of CDM, the last one being in 2015. But it has still been a long journey, and we have to keep reminding ourselves of the principles of CDM and what we are doing about it. And in fact, I went to an ill health summit that was organised by the HSE only last week, and we still have, despite the move that John Prescott put in, and despite all the hard work that's gone on from the HSE and from industry, that health summit last week identified there were still significant numbers of people suffering from respiratory disease, still significant numbers suffering from musculoskeletal injuries. But the worst statistic for me was the one talking about mental health. And so, to me, this is where the whole topic comes together. We not only need to be buildings of quality that perform, but we need to be looking after our own industry. And the only way we do that is by paying attention to how people work on a day-to-day basis, and how we look after them. We still have in the construction industry the worst mental health record apart from in agriculture. That in today's society is completely wrong. And we should be looking after people, particularly in a period where we all recognise there is a skills shortage in construction. And there are two problems that emanate from that. One is that the people we've got, we need to look after as long as possible. And we need to encourage new people into the industry. And without a doubt, people looking at joining the construction industry, if they consider the statistics, both mental health and all the other aspects, it really is not a good picture. And so that, to me, is a key constituent that we have to address in the state of the nation of the construction industry today. Another element to this is, whilst all this development was going on with health and safety following the Prescott Summit, following CDM being developed and rolled out in a number of forms, through this period, we have had the ascendance of the design and build contract. And I have to say that looking back now, certainly with the benefit of the evidence from Grenfell and other similar problems that we had prior to this, we have developed an industry where responsibility has slipped away, where it is difficult to work out who actually is in charge of any particular project, where we cannot actually define what products were used in any particular building. And for me, most critically, worst of all, is a scant regard to regulation. It seems that custom and practice has taken over. It seems that fastest and cheapest rules the day. It seems that if we can just get by, then that's good enough. Well, actually, it's not when you're constructing buildings. Buildings need to perform, and perform in every single respect. And a sad state of affairs in this, of course, is the fact that we are trying to decarbonise the industry, and we are trying to produce buildings that are far less energy intensive. When we go back and analyse the performance of those buildings, we find that they are way below the performance that was required in the original design, and dare I say, even in the regulations. And we look at the task ahead. What have we got to do? We've got to retrofit millions of homes to bring them to a satisfactory level of performance, and we've got to build new homes that perform not just safely, not just in terms of the fire protection issues, but also in terms of the environment. And that includes, of course, minimal waste, recycling, circular economy, and making sure that we can use the best materials in the best way and not squander the opportunities that exist in terms of new construction. So I think that there is a real challenge across a number of threads that we have to confront. We have to confront the issue of what do we actually build, how do we actually build it, looking after the workforce, looking after the industry, so that we can further mature things, further develop things for the future. If we look at how we've got to this stage, I think the evidence is clearly there. Analysing the Grenfell public inquiry gives you a clear feeling of parts of the industry not understanding what they should as a matter of default. It means that we've got an industry that is spread out, that is fractured in many ways, and we need to bring things back. Now, that's a rather depressing viewpoint, and so I need to put a bit of optimism on the table as well. And the optimism comes from the point of view of a significant amount of work that's gone on since Grenfell, a significant amount of work that is starting to address some of these key issues. But nonetheless, industry continues and needs to continue to work with government closely to pick up on the practicalities that sometimes go missing when government decides to regulate or decides to bring in policy without testing it with industry first. We have a number of key operations that are going on currently. The Construction Leadership Council continues to work closely with government across a number of different areas. Certainly from the Construction Products Association point of view, we talk to 5 government departments on a regular basis, if not every week. And that is really important to continue with that close liaison to make sure that we can just focus in on what we are meant to be doing and how we're taking things forward. If I just revert back slightly to Brexit for a second, Brexit was a major situation for the construction industry. And to me, this is a great example of where politics takes over from the practicality of industry. The supply chain for construction is pan-European, if not global. So to fracture that in such a critical way was a real problem and continues to be a real problem. And we've seen that with the fallout of CA marking, which was never going to work for construction products, and it took us 3 years to convince government that it would never work. And we hope we're on a different footing now with the new government and trying to rebuild those bridges with the rest of Europe, because during that period, construction product manufacturing across Europe has not changed its ethos. We still have major manufacturers based across Europe, and we still have major manufacturing centres across Europe that need to feed into the UK industry, and equally industry here needs to export out to Europe, although it is much more difficult now. And what we've done is bought ourselves a whole load of bureaucracy with actually no real benefit on the ground. And as I've said, there are so many different things that we have got to tackle at the moment. We don't need that extra weight, that extra drag on the systems. Some will say that the reason that we have got a flat economy, the reason that we haven't been able to expand, it is down to the effects of Brexit. And we need to have a period of realism that is going to take things forward and sort out those issues. And of course, we did have Brexit and Grenfell in the same year, and recovering from that huge shock is going to take some time and is going to be quite difficult. If I just then turn to what we have learned from Grenfell in the final few minutes, the issue for me is one of the analysis since Grenfell happened has been very clear. We have had too much diffusion of control, too much lack of understanding of how things come together. Buildings are systems, and they need to be treated as a system task. We need to have full understanding of building regs. The industry has, to me, lost the ability to understand that it is the functional requirements in the approved documents that are the regulations. The rest is guidance. Obsessing with discussions over the details of whether the guidance tells you this or whether the guidance tells you that is completely ridiculous and a total waste of time. The point is, we need people who are competent, confident, and understand what a functional requirement is about, what it means, and how you design a building around that. And they need to be given the authority to land that design and make it drive the rest of the project. We have seen recently a so-called friction across Gateway 2 in the new process. And undoubtedly, the whole industry for high-rise residential is moving into an entirely different arena. The new regulator is learning and building capability and capacity. And I think we will benefit as an industry from that. Having a stern master is no bad thing. It means that you have to raise your standards. You have to understand that this is a very serious job, and you have to understand that when you build a building, other people's lives depend on you building it correctly in every detail. And I think we've had very, very poor adherence to those principles in recent decades. We have a huge problem as a nation to remediate all the existing buildings that need remediation. I am concerned at the moment that the focus is entirely on cladding when there are lots of other safety elements that need addressing, and I would say compartmentation, fire doors, smoke ventilation need an equal amount of attention to make sure homes are completely safe as they should be. So we need to have people in the industry who understand those issues, who understand exactly what the building regs mean that you should be doing. And in parallel with that, of course, the building regs are supported by a huge number of British, European and international standards. And to me, one of the most important things, being a professional in the construction industry, is to have a clear understanding of all those underlying standards. You don't have to know every word. You potentially don't have to know the detail, but you do have to know that they exist, and you have to know the scope and how, most importantly of all, they all interact. This is a complicated task, building a building. It has many different levels and many different moving parts. And as I said just now, buildings are a system. They are not just individual bits that go together, or individual regulations or standards that just go together. They have to work in harmony. They have to complement each other, and you have to be competent that for all the characteristics they perform. And sadly, the evidence shows us that none of that was taken account of in Grenfell. It wasn't taken account of in Lakenhall House, and it wasn't taken account of in the many examples of serious problems that we have had before. So we need to really get a grip on what is intended. Now, coming out of the Grenfell inquiry, the recommendations are taking us into new territory. Now, taking us into looking at an overall construction minister, which may be a good thing, because they do seem to come along like buses at the moment. And we cannot have government at the highest level which is just paying lip service to such a large industry. We need some stable operation at the top of the chain. But then also we need an industry that can deliver. And what that to me means is that we need to put performance, regulation and competence at the top of the list, and not cheapest and fastest. That is simply not tenable, and it's not sustainable. So we need to make sure that we learn the lessons, and the key recommendations that the Grenfell Public Inquiry has come up with, as I say, a single regulator, joining up various departments together, producing centralisation, might not necessarily be the right answer, might not necessarily be everybody's desired approach. And I say that because in those long 7 years since Grenfell, an awful lot has happened. And possibly many people outside of the construction industry won't recognise that change, but certainly all of us inside that tent know full well that an awful lot has been done, an awful lot has been moved forward. And I think the trick will be, and we have yet to see obviously the government's response to the Grenfell Public Inquiry, but certainly from the research done so far from industry's side, we need to very carefully pick amongst the recommendations and look at which ones will help with that already large arena of changes and actions that have been undertaken, and that will not hinder things going forward. Because one of the worries is that if we were to say, okay, yes, we're going to take on board some of those big ticket items that have come out of the inquiry, then we're going to end up with actually further delay. And again, it is most disappointing and regrettable that we still have people in high-rise buildings that have potentially problematic situations that have not been resolved yet. And that it is down to a number of clear reasons, but nonetheless there should be focus and attention, and I think the government's position on that is entirely right. But we don't have, despite the size of the industry, we don't have an endless capacity or endless ability to move things forward, and that's been shown in the remediation program so far. But nonetheless, going forward, taking on board some of the recommendations, looking at what the underlying issue is, and then taking that forward in the industry over the next 10 to 20 years, I think is really important. But I think the equally the important thing is to keep an eye on the direction of travel. So often, as I said, we get into a situation where we come up with a problem, we think we fixed it, and then we forget it. And I don't think we can do that with something like the construction industry. To me, one of the best things we could do at this stage would be have a completely independent body that would occasionally look at the construction industry, for instance, equivalent of the Office of Budget Responsibility. And maybe we need an Office of Construction Responsibility that's out there, entirely separate, and will just monitor the progress of the industry and has the power to wield a stick when it needs to against anybody, against the minister, the politicians, the departments, and anybody in the sector as well. I think perhaps I should just finish. I always try and make any presentation I do upbeat, but I think it is quite challenging at the moment to be upbeat across many of these things. But the important messaging that I think I'd like to leave everybody with is that many of us have learnt the lessons. Many of us are striving to push the industry into a different position, and many of us remain optimistic. After all, this country does produce some of the world's best buildings across the world, and that's down to the training, the tenacity, the experience, the competence of people in it. It is by far and away composed of people who are competent, who do want to do the right thing, but we still have a significant group who actually do not want to take part. And believe me, the regulators are coming. I've seen the approach, and anybody within the construction industry, if they think that this new approach that's needed is not going to affect them, well, I've got news for you. You will be affected by it. Somebody will come knocking, somebody will pick something up, and you will have to change. And that is probably my final contribution in this part of today's proceedings. Thank you all for listening, and hopefully we've got time for a few questions now. And back to you. Thank you.
Peter, thank you. Brilliant and insightful as always. You are kindly going to stay with us just for, while we hear from Hal, and then we'll all come together and we do have some questions for you. So thank you, Peter. Oh, okay. In terms of our next speaker, Hal has been active in British standards development for 35 years. Probably known him much shorter than that. He has worked closely on building legislation, standards, and industry guidance, including harmonised standards for construction products, something that Peter just touched upon, under the original Construction Products Directive, working with former Government Chief Construction Advisor Paul Morrell on the 2023 review of construction product testing and certification. As a leader within the built environment, Hal currently chairs BSI Committee on Information Management and Data Exchange and is Deputy Chair of the Construction Industry Council Building Safety Committee. He serves as a member of the Building Advisory Committee of the Building Safety Regulator, having been the last chair of the Building Regulations Advisory Committee before it was abolished in 2023. I think we all know Hal as well, but Hal, it's great for us to have you today. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, Ant. And I'm just hoping that the slides will progress. There we go. I do want to start by pausing to remember why we're having this conversation. And I will come back to the public inquiry report in a little more detail later, but I want to pick on the statement that Sir Martin Morbick made on the morning that the report was published, that was very clear that what happened at Grenfell Tower, the 72 deaths that occurred, were all avoidable. And I think it's important that we dwell on that just for a few seconds, because 7.5 years on, it is easy for people to forget why we're doing this. And I was particularly struck by a line on a slide in a talk that Dame Judith Hackett gave just last Thursday evening, where apparently one organisation that was applying to do building work to the Building Safety Regulator put in response to one question, "We don't know why we have to do this, it complies." We've clearly got people who still have not understood how catastrophically things went wrong at Grenfell and the need for change. I very much doubt any of them are on this call, and I'm sure that the fact that you're on this call means that you do appreciate. But I think we need to be aware of the bigger industry within which we operate, where, to be very blunt, I think there are far too many people. I don't disagree with Peter, there are many who do get it, but there are far too many who don't. So with that rather somber start, I'm going to start off. I actually want to say, Peter has said a number of things that I might have touched on, and I will therefore skip over because I've got a lot to cover. But I do want to stress a couple of things at the outset. The first is that the Building Safety Act and all the various supporting measures apply to all building work. There are people out there who think that because it's a response to the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and that was a high-rise block of flats, it's all about high-rise blocks of flats. I'm not sure they could be much more wrong. It is about all building work. As some have put it, from a shed to the shard. I think they may mean industrial or retail sheds rather than garden sheds, which are not building work. But if it is building work as defined in Regulation 3 of the Building Regs, then it's covered by the Building Safety Act. It's that far-ranging. And it also applies, as Hannah and Ian will talk about later, it applies to everybody doing building work. I also want to pick up on something Peter said about safety. It's very easy, because the Building Safety Act focuses on fire and structural risks in higher risk buildings, in the parts of the Act that deal with higher risk buildings, it's very easy to forget that a damp and mouldy flat, however many stories the building is not safe. Damp and mould kills. The tragic case of Awab Ishak, the 2-year-old who died in Rochdale in 2020, demonstrates that inadequate ventilation, poorly heated homes can be killers. It just won't be on the scale and with the catastrophic consequences of what happened at Grenfell. But we know that we have got huge issues around healthy buildings. And I want to preface everything I say in the next 20 minutes with the comment that there will be a focus on fire and structure, but actually the building regulations are made for the purpose of improving the health, safety and well-being of those in and around buildings. If it doesn't improve health, safety and well-being, it's actually not a legitimate thing to put in the building regulations according to the Building Act, even after it's been amended. So there's a great deal for us to think about that's not just fire and structure. And a final comment on something Peter said. Building safety is not just about cladding, and unfortunately the Grenfell crisis, as well as being a cladding crisis, has revealed that there is a huge amount of other work that needs doing to make buildings safe. Indeed, Lord Lytton in the House of Lords debate a couple of weeks ago suggested that the cost of putting all safety defects right is probably equal to the cost of putting cladding right. So that comes in at about £32 billion. So there's an awful lot going on, and it's not just building safety. We've got digitalisation, we've got modularisation, we've got timbering construction, we've got all the stuff going on around energy and decarbonisation, which Peter mentioned. We've got conversations about a new future homes and future building standard. We've even had a new part to the building regs, Part T, which is the new section on toilets. The fact that it's Part T and toilet is entirely coincidental, but it's there. And all of this is going alongside building safety reform, and we have to address it. And I'm trying to get the slides to move on.
If you just click back on the screen, then it should be.
I have clicked back on the screen, and there we go. There we go. That's great. So it is all very complicated. There are lots of moving parts. As Peter said, there are 5 government departments involved. So that'll keep it all quick and easy, won't it? Now, I wouldn't like a morning session to go without a reference to an American called Donald, but this one is the late Donald Rumsfeld, and I think everybody's familiar with this. And I want to run through what we know that we know, what we know that we don't know, and I've even got a quick comment on the things that are unknown unknowns. It's a useful analysis. So what do we know that we know? We know we've got the Building Safety Act, and it is largely up and running now. It's taken a little while, but it's there. Not just the Building Safety Act, but the Fire Safety Act. And both of those have enabled government to introduce a wide range of regulations, not least of which are the Building Regulations, etc. Amendment England Regulations 2023. Much of the Building Safety Act applies to England. However, it changes the Building Act, which also applies in Wales, but the implementation will be undertaken by the Welsh Government. Scotland has an independent system of building regulation, but construction products and architects registration are covered by the Act and do apply in Scotland, and also whilst Northern Ireland has its own building regs, aspects relating to architects and construction products also apply in Northern Ireland, subject of course to the Windsor Agreement, which I'm not going to touch this morning. So there's a lot going on. What are the headline issues? Well, we've got some significant changes. It affects the whole industry. And I'm going to hammer this one home, if I may. It's all buildings, it's all controlled building work, and it creates the Building Safety Regulator. And again, going back to Peter's remarks about CDM, the Safety Summit, I am going to go back even further, because 50 years ago this year, the Health and Safety Executive was created under the Health and Safety at Work Act. Now, I wasn't working in the industry then, but I am reliably informed by those who were there at the time that setting up a new regulator and an outcomes-based regime was a radical change, and it did take time and mistakes were made. It's worth remembering that as we grapple with the creation of the Building Safety Regulator and an outcomes-based regime for buildings and the new regime for occupied higher risk buildings. It is going to take time and there will be some mistakes. And dare I say, the regulator may make them, and the industry may also make mistakes in responding. We've got to work through it and accept that it will be a time of difficulty, and that is going to take a bit of getting used to. It's also worth noting that the Safety Summit in 2001 was 27 years after the Health and Safety at Work Act came in. And in the words of Dame Judith again last night, that's because the industry took nearly 30 years to get to grips with the Health and Safety at Work Act. I don't think it's going to come as a shock to anybody. The construction industry is not going to be given 30 years to get to grips with the Building Safety Act. I don't think it's going to be given 3 years. We've got to get to grips with this. We have a new regulated status for building control, so that's a big deal. We have a new approach to competence, which Hannah and Ian will talk about. And I do want to make the brief observation that, again, the competence arrangements and the new accountabilities and duties, which include clients, apply to all buildings and all those doing building work. It's far-reaching. New processes for approval of full plans, restriction of building notices, and for higher risk buildings, we have the golden thread and a new management regime, and we have a new regulator for construction products in the Office of Product Safety and Standards. And and this will remind us, building control is now a regulated profession. They are there to mark the industry's homework. They are not there as tutors to help do the homework. So they won't be giving advice. They're not designers. They have a regulatory function. The OPSS is there to enforce the new regime for construction product standards. And before anybody gets in and asks the question, well, what is the new regime for construction product standards? I'm sorry, but we're still waiting. And again, it's notable that last week Dame Judith called on 3 separate occasions in her presentation for government to tell us what it's going to do about construction product regulation, and indeed very specifically, what is it going to do with the independent review of product testing and certification undertaken by Paul Morell and Annalise Day, KC, which was published in April last year and must have been on the government's desk in draft form for a little while beyond that. There are some things that as an industry we simply can't do without government telling us what it's going to do about construction product regulation, and I'll touch on it in a bit more detail in a minute. I won't dwell on this, but these slides will be available in the pack, and they remind us what a higher risk building is. It's over 18 metres or 7 stories, and it contains any of 2 or more residential units, so that's a residential HRB, a care home or a hospital. If it's a care home or a hospital, there is already a regime for those in operation. They cease to be higher risk buildings when they're completed, but they become one again when building work is done in them. And that creates some challenges which I'm not going into this morning. Residential HRBs are residential buildings throughout their operation and occupation, and they now have accountable persons responsible for the safety of those buildings. And the law defines who the accountable person is. You can't duck it by appointing a management agent. They're still your agent. You're the accountable person. And that's a huge shift for the sector. Peter talked about buildings as a system, and I did have this slide in before I heard him, but the whole point of the HRB regime, and indeed of the golden thread, is to treat the building as a single system and not a series of silos, with a robust set of information about that building, and that's the golden thread. I do want to make the comment that the golden thread needs to be available to residents. They have statutory rights to this information, and they have a right of complaint to the regulator if those rights are not respected. So it is fundamentally and ultimately about making residents safe and demonstrating to residents why they are safe. It's not enough to say, oh, we don't know why we have to do this, it complies. Don't know why we have to do this, it's safe. No, show us the evidence, because the post-Grenfell evidence is that that statement was simply untrue and unreliable in far too many buildings before Grenfell, and is still untrue and unreliable if it's made about some buildings today. So the golden thread has been set up. It's a legal requirement for HRBs. It would be a darned good idea on many others, and I know some of the larger developers are already planning to do it because it makes sense, not because they have to. We know we've got the Grenfell Tower inquiry report and the recommendations, and I'll come back to them in a minute later. So what do we not know? Well, we don't know what the government is going to do about the report. The Prime Minister has committed government to respond by the 3rd or 4th of March. That will be the six-month anniversary. But what is government going to change? We don't know at this point. We don't know what the government's going to do about the Morel Day review. And frankly, as a construction product sector, we jolly well need to. There's a lot going on in this space. We don't know for sure what's happening on net zero. We've had talk of the changes to our targets under the Climate Change Act. We had changes in 2022 to some of the building regulations, and here they are. Part L was changed, Part O came in as a new part. Are they going to be changed under the Future Homes and the Future Building Standards? There was a consultation under the previous administration, and I understand there were about 2,000 comments, and officials are now working through them. And they will be looking to make the carbon emissions targets more challenging. But of course, they're going to have to look at the impact of that, and they're going to have to look at the impact of that in a sector that has recently been hit with a 2% increase in national insurance contributions, changes to the thresholds at which employers' national insurance is payable, increases to the minimum wage. They're all costs to the business which construction products manufacturers will have to bear. There is a limit to how much we can load costs onto the sector. And I will say now, I wasn't asked to say that by Peter. I think it's a blindingly obvious observation by any dispassionate observer. And I'm not making a political point either. I'm merely pointing to the economics. So what else? Well, we've got digital product passports coming up in Europe, and they are going to require a significant new approach, the production of digital product passports to support CE marking and placing on the market. And I will make the observation that CE marking is a mechanism for placing products on the market and removing barriers to trade. The CE mark is not a safety mark, and it's really important that anybody who thinks that it is a safety mark understands that it isn't very quickly. And I say that regardless of where they work. They might be in government, but if they think it's a safety mark, I'm sorry, it isn't. And this slide shows the various things that will be required around product testing and certification. And this is all going to be digitalized so that the product passports will be digital product passports. And before anybody says, yes, I know we've left the European Union, but an awful lot of our products, I believe about 70%, and Peter may correct me in the panel session, are manufactured for sale on the European Union market. So they're going to have to do this stuff. If the UK comes up with a separate construction products regime that does not align with what's going on in Europe, that will be a further cost burden on the sector, which for some manufacturers faced with a choice of a market of 300 million in Europe, a market of 60 million in the UK, well, actually, we'll concentrate on the 300 million. Thank you very much. You want to build 1.5 million homes in the UK? Good luck to you, but you won't be using our products because you've just made it too expensive. And then there are the unknown unknowns, and we do need a little bit of levity here. I'm sorry, but I don't know what they are. So what has Sir Martin Morbick recommended? Well, first of all, about half the recommendations relate to construction and half to fire and rescue. It is worth saying that the recommendations are based on evidence that concluded 2 years ago, in fact 2 years and a month ago. November the 10th, 2022 was the final evidence session at which Sir Martin Morbick made his, I think, quite well-known merry-go-round of blame presentation, or web of blame as it's sometimes been called. The recommendations are quite wide-ranging, and I will put my colours on the mast. I think the commitment and professionalism of the panel is absolutely remarkable. They sat through 7 years of this, and their analysis and their and the evidence they have brought forward in the final inquiry is simply unquestionable. They have done a very thorough job. Some of the recommendations, I think in part because they were 2 years in the making, have been overtaken by events and may not necessarily be the only way of achieving what they want to achieve. And so there will need to be some discussion about how we cover them. There are recommendations about building control. We need to be really careful what further changes we make to building control if we want to avoid a further flight from the profession and cause a huge capacity issue around building control. We need to think about how we regulate fire engineers, and indeed, is it just fire engineers, or should it be structural engineers, facade engineers, maybe even lift engineers because of the role of lifts in evacuation and firefighting. There's a lot of work to be done here. Sir Martin makes recommendations about product testing and certification. They can't be implemented without knowing what government's plans are in that area and indeed how things are emerging in Europe. There's a lot to do, and I will only be able to touch on a few of them. I've commented on building control. In the area of regulation of fire engineers, we do need to know what a competent fire engineer looks like, how they're recognised, and we need to reserve certain tasks for people who meet that definition and recognition. And that needs urgent work, and dare I say, perhaps it should have started a number of years ago. And we do need more academic training courses for fire engineers. I am mindful of the clock, and there are suggestions about machinery of government changes and about a review of the definition of higher risk buildings. My comment on these, and this is my view, but I don't think I'm alone in it. Indeed, Dame Judith made similar comments last week. More machinery of government changes right now when we're trying to get the whole thing up and running, and where there is provision in the Building Safety Act for a review after 5 years, would it perhaps be a good idea to focus on getting the system up and running properly and then review how it's working and whether it's delivering both the policy intent and the things Sir Martin has recommended before we have more machinery of government changes? They're complicated, they take time. I believe they will hold up the delivery of safer buildings if undertaken at this point. But maybe there will be questions on that. Standards related developments, and this is important in a BSI context. There are recommendations that we should have more professional and academic participants in developing test methods. Indeed, the inquiry doesn't actually mention that test methods are normally developed by the national standards body, and it's absolutely vital that we have the best people working with BSI. BSI is utterly dependent on its committee experts. No committee experts, no content, no revenue is something that BSI needs to recall. and we need the best experts working on new test methods for fire safety and indeed for anything else. One of the recommendations of Paul Morell is that we need to be sure that the test methods we've got are fit for purpose and that they do what's required. And so I think this applies beyond fire testing to all aspects of construction products. And I know that BSI is already doing some work in this area. I need to move very quickly now because I am running out of time. I've put these slides in and I will let people look at them. But the golden thread is the information that allows an accountable person to understand the building they're accountable for and what they need to do to keep that building and the people who live in it, work in it, visit it safe now and in the future. It's the right information with the right people at the right time. And it applies through design, construction, at completion and into occupation. And people need to start getting a grip on that at the very earliest stages. And the regulator's mantra is that the golden thread should inform the development of documents and information. It should help you to demonstrate how you meet planning conditions, how you meet the relevant building regs, and what changes you've made. And it's all about demonstrating functional compliance with all applicable building regulations. You may want to follow some of the guidance, but you don't have to. You must comply with the regulations. You have no choice. And it's all about identifying risks, clarifying what's being done to manage them, and then justifying your approach. There is some guidance from the CLC, and that's available online from the CLC website. There is also a huge amount of guidance from the UK BIM framework, with which BSI has been closely involved, and B555, which is the committee I currently chair. And there's a huge resource in the UK BIM framework. And with that, I am going to apologise for running over 2 minutes. Thank you for listening. Allow our staff to take back control of the screen, and over to Ant for questions.
Thank you, Hal. Again, brilliant as always. A lot there, massively insightful, and I think a very fair reflection of perhaps where we are and people's understanding and appreciation of the new responsibilities, the definitive responsibilities, but so much more needs to be covered and people need to become ever greater aware under the new regulatory regime. Thank you. So moving to questions if we've had a number come in prior to the event, and we've had a couple whilst we're speaking, you were presenting more correctly. Please do keep them coming in, but we'll probably bounce around a bit if that's okay, because Peter, you did give that overview, that state of the nation, and of course how very focused as was asked in terms of Grenfell, but there was lots of crossovers. So maybe a first question, if I may, to Peter, but Howard, welcome your thoughts thereafter. Look, Peter, you raised some hugely important points with regards to well-being, including mental health. Okay, and this is something I think we need to return to time and time again. But before we do that, what more could or should we be doing collectively, including BSI, to support our people in our industry?
Yeah, great question to start with, and I think the issues certainly that I learned at the summit last week was that there are a lot of people engaged in this arena. There is a lot of good guidance, and there's a lot of good practice actually that is established at helping organisations and people through this. So I think the way this breaks down is firstly, everybody should be aware of the things that are available, and everybody should be aware of good practice processes that every person and every organisation should adopt. Okay, so it is quite tricky in construction industry is mainly blokes. Let's be honest, blokes aren't all that good at talking about feelings. Present company accepted, of course, but you do get to a situation where we have got to, for our own benefit, for the benefit of the future of the industry, step beyond that and start to really get stuck in. that's the good bit. I think the bad bit is that we still have an industry, as I said, where there's a lot of people suffering, and mainly suffering in silence, actually. And the question for me is, how do we tackle that going forward? I mean, I could turn this into another seminar just on this, but I won't, because I'll give Howell a chance to chip in at that point.
Thank you, Peter. Hal, any thoughts, sir?
I'm going to be very quick. When COVID struck, the industry sorted out safe working practices to keep sites open in a matter of 2 weeks. Senior people in the industry got up every morning thinking about, how do we deliver a safe working system to keep the sites open now? And I'm afraid it comes down to leadership again. If the senior people in the industry really agree that mental health is a massive industry problem, perhaps we need the same level of urgency about what we do about it as we showed to keeping sites open in COVID. And Peter, you're involved in CLC. I'll leave that one with you to share with your colleagues.
Thank you. I will.
Brilliant. Look, great response. Thank you. And from my perspective, thinking here as sitting within BSI, there's lots we do in this broad space, but I think there's a lot more we can do, and it's something I'd like to return to another time. Peter, you spoke about sort of the remediation backdrop. Lots achieved so far, but so much more to do, thinking about capacity. I think it was Howell as well mentioned the 1.5 million homes commitment by our still fairly newish government by 2030. Do we have the capacity and the supply chains needed to deliver 1.5 million new homes by 2030?
Not a chance. Not a chance. I admire the ambition, and I think also I admire the strident call for sorting out the housing crisis. You know, it is despicable that we've got an economy that's the 5th largest in the world, and we have people who are desperately homeless. We have people who are on housing waiting lists, and this digs at society in so many different ways, and is so wasteful in terms of people's lives, and it's wasteful in terms of us as a nation. So we do need to get up and do something about this. But on the other side of the coin, we need a target, but we have never built anywhere near 1.5 million houses. I think, just off the top of my head, if we just look at this in terms of bricks, and I know some people will say, well, we shouldn't be building all the houses out of bricks, fine. But if we look at that, the maximum capacity of the brick industry is about, that it's ever been, is about 2/3 of that you would need to build that number of houses in that time frame. It takes 10 years to build a brick line, and so therefore you just see the problem. And equally, we really should not be importing things like bricks from overseas. We come back to a problem of carbon, we come back to a problem of quality, and actually, as other economies go in their different directions, that we might simply not have the ability to import them anyway. So that's just focusing on one bit of the supply chain. But the more critical issue is at either end, as I would crudely put it. One, they have to sort out planning, because everything is held up because of the current planning situation, and that's about, mainly in my book, resourcing planning authorities. But it's also the other end, if you like. The number of skilled people we have in the industry just isn't anywhere near enough to gear up to do it. So I'll stop there, and
so apart from that, it's okay. Yeah.
Apart from that, it's absolutely brilliant. Yeah, apart from that, it's wonderful. Put your order in now.
Absolutely. I mean, but joking aside, how did you have any thoughts on that, sir?
I agree with every word Peter has said. I believe over the last 10 years, we've managed just over 200,000 a year. So a 50% uptick just like that, because a new minister says so or a manifesto says so, doesn't strike me as very realistic. Set against that, they were competing with a manifesto that also had the same number in. But I think the concern for me is that when reality dawns and the government has to acknowledge that it can't be done, they may start looking for a scapegoat. We need to be careful it's not us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. That's that two-way dialogue with industry, with our government and the relevant ministers, being very clear what we can and cannot do. And even if, from what you described, Peter, a more sensible target, meaningful but sensible, is put in place, it still deserves additional activity to even unlock meeting a lesser
Yeah.
target and still building to quality buildings that perform.
Yeah.
For the
100%.
avoidance of doubt, we need more homes, but also
Yeah.
the other thing is, how much housing stock is there that needs remediating and bringing back into use that might not need as many bricks as a new home?
Yeah.
You know, we and I'm sorry, but refurbishment of existing stock is the Cinderella topic. When on earth, there are no targets about refurbishment. 1.5 million new homes. Well, yes, fine, but where's the target for how many homes we're going to refurbish? Because if we're serious about net zero by 2050, we've got to refurbish a housing stock of something like 26 million in about 26 years. That looks like 1 million a year refurbishments, and we're struggling with 300,000. It's vast, and we simply
And
haven't got the people to do it.
Howard, if I can chip in at that point, and of course we've just heard the announcement of an accelerated remediation program,
Yeah.
which as we currently see it, is around 4,000 dwellings. But I feel okay, but that's not the end of it. We're only dealing with buildings over 11 meters. There are many under 11 meters that need addressing, and there are many others probably that we haven't even got on the radar yet.
Yeah. So much to do. I'm very mindful of the time, but I do want to ask, because you both touched upon this, and I'm very mindful. As a former official at MHCLG, and in the spirit of openness and transparency, I did appear before the Grenfell inquiry and similar. But we've heard from the previous government of the day, our new building safety regulator, and big industry leaders like Dame Judith. They continue to push for the industry to step up more. What do you feel that means, and what more should the industry be doing to help itself?
So,
Peter.
if I can kick off, Ant, thank you. So I think, as I said, an awful lot been
Yeah.
has been done. An awful lot is carrying on. There are literally thousands of people working in their own time, every minute of the working week, working on moving the industry into a different place. So I think that is testament to how much goodwill there is and how much focus there is on moving to a different place. So that's great. I think the debate around the industry stepping up, I think, is a challenge, because many across the industry will have suffered from leading on initiatives that government has started, only to find that when they've invested time and good money, millions and thousands of people literally, that policy is then pulled, and they're left with a crisis on their hands. And so many across the industry are reluctant to lead, even though they're very willing to be part of the current wave. So I think there's a real challenge for all of us there in trying to encourage people to step up when there isn't a framework, there isn't a leadership of government in the space. Nonetheless, I think what we should do, and what we are doing certainly through the CLC, is we are challenging government every week. We are challenging the position, not in a confrontational way. We are just saying, right, okay, so what's the plan? As Hal said, what's the plan with the product information? What's the plan with this, that, everything?
Yeah.
And we hope that has, and I think there is evidence that has been met by, okay, we're working on this and we're working on that, and we have got an answer for this. There is a lot of cooperation, but there is also a lot of incoherence. There's a lot of things that we would like to know now that we don't. I think it's unfortunate the way the string of things have played out. Brexit, the elections, etc., etc. They've all had an impact on the direction of travel. But I think we're generally in a not too bad a place, but we can do more.
We can do more. Howell, I'm mindful of the time, but did you have anything quickly you wanted to add to that?
Well, I'll chip in one thing. Having spent much of my career working amongst professional bodies, I do think some of the professional bodies could step up and do more. I think they could provide more guidance. I think, and I'm going to use Dame Judith's description of continuing professional development last week. The current system of continuing professional development is a joke. We don't have rigour about what passes for CPD. I get asked to review CPD presentations sometimes that have very impressive logos on them, and I read the content and I think, why on earth is the logo of that organisation on this set of slides? It's simply not good enough. And we've got to get to a system whereby people are doing constant professional development and learning and keeping up to date. And I would like to think that, attending this very much classes as that, but the professional bodies have got to get real about it. And as Dame Judith said last week, that means if people are not doing CPD, there needs to be a sanction. And that might mean professional bodies start losing some subscriptions. Well, too bad. Professional bodies, many of them are charities, they're there for the public benefit.
Absolutely. Very well said.
Well said.
Very well said, but and somebody that was intrinsically involved in one professional body, I watched how it can be done very, very well, but I'm also mindful where perhaps that isn't happening. Gentlemen, thank you. We've run out of time. We've actually gone a smidge over, but I think we really needed to explore some of that. But many, many thanks, as always, to both of you and for all you do for BSI and our industry. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Not at all, Len. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'll let you step away now, Peter. I know you've got a dash to London now. So all the best and thank you. Now that ends the first part of the morning session. I'm now going to hand you over to the very capable hands of my colleague, Ian Richardson, that will take you through the second part. Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Al. I was so engrossed in that session, I forgot that I was part of it. So I just reset for a moment as we go into the next part of this morning. So good morning, everyone. Hope you're well, and thanks for taking the time to join us this morning. My name is Ian Richardson. I'm one of the sector leads at BSI in the built environment sector team. I've actually worked at BSI for over 20 years in lots of different standards development roles. But over the last few years in the built environment team, working on topics, funnily enough, such as construction products, competency and quality management. So following on from Ant's session with Peter and Hal, we, as you can imagine, have another set of fantastic speakers about to appear in Hannah, Musa and Dan. If you consider the breadth of topics, I guess that's probably why I say I was so engrossed. That you just heard about with Ant, Peter and Howell. We could easily have dug deeper into any of them, just how they're listening to Howell speak about construction products. We could have had the rest of the day to talk about construction products. Many of these topics need a dedicated session. You'll find one this afternoon on digital, as Ant has already said. But I think in terms of competency being so central to many of the recommendations that have come out of reports that you've heard reference to so far and will continue to hear in the next hour or so, relating to Dame Judith Hackett's report, the Paul Morrell and Lisa Day Testing for a Safer Future report, and most recently, obviously, the Grenfell Tower Inquiry final report. I think the feeling is that this is it's a timely point for us to talk about competency. It's a perfect opportunity for us to give you an overview of activity, whether that be with Hannah and the ICSG or Musa and Dan from the BSR, and of course many of the standards that underpin all of this activity, those that are published by BSI. And I think you will have seen that echoed by Peter in his State of the Nation summary at the beginning. So, without further ado, I'm sure you want to hear less from me, but more from Hannah. I will now introduce Hannah Clark. Here she comes. In she
Hi,
comes.
can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can see you and hear you, which is wonderful.
Wonderful.
I'm going to
Fantastic.
bring up your bio. So this is unsurprisingly a very chunky bio for Hannah. So this may take me a moment or two to read it all
Oh
out, because we have someone who is very, very experienced and very, very echoing some of Ant's comments about Howell and Peter. You do so much for us on all of the standards activity. I really appreciate it on a personal level and a professional level. So thank you so much for taking some more time to join us this morning. Hannah is Digital and Policy Manager at the CPA, the Construction Products Association, background in facilities management, gaining a specialization in planned preventative maintenance data architecture for computer-assisted facilities management systems, ergonomic logistics and innovation. Makes my history degree look a little bit pathetic, doesn't it, Hannah? But never mind. Hannah joined the CPA in August 2017, worked predominantly on the post-Grenfell and digital projects and policy, also representing CPA Industry Response Group initiated by government, steering actions to make existing buildings safe in the wake of the Grenfell disaster. Obviously, working very closely with MHCLG and the Building Safety Regulator, OPSS, on the competence and construction product work resulting from the Hackett Review. Hannah sits on the IRG Competent Steering Group, is chair of the CSG Strategy Group, and is co-chair of Working Group 12, which I'm sure you're about to talk about, Product Competence Group, lead author of the Built Environment Proposed Construction Products Competence Standard. So she was the CPA lead on the CPA Marketing Integrity Group, developing the code for construction product information, and contributes to the CPA Technical Committee. So, after all of that, Hannah, I really appreciate you now running through
Yeah.
competent construction products, and over to you.
No, that's very kind of you. I'm afraid it's a little bit of an outdated bio. I should have updated you. So now I'm the chair of the Industry Competence Steering Group as well, and we sit on CPB1, Built Environment as well, Competence. So, well, anyway, that was such a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And I do really enjoy working with BSI. We do a lot of work together. Right, now I'm going to just work out how this goes. Okay, oh, lovely. Right, so I've got the slides working. I'm going to talk to you about, it says in my introduction that I'm going to be talking, or on the agenda it says I'm going to be talking about competence with construction products. I'm actually going to speak to you a bit about competence and construction products and competence with construction products. Let's throw it all in there. Let's see what we can do. So a bit about the Construction Products Association. So Peter has already given you a bit of an overview. But I think it's worth saying that, well, the Construction Products Association, we represent over 85% of all manufacturers and distributors of construction products in the UK, and 78% of all the construction products used in the UK are made right here in the UK. So as Peter says, we do really represent quite a vibrant part of the UK economy. Oh, look, I'm not working this very well. There we go, that's better. Thankfully, because I've got limited time to talk to you, Hal has already given you a really great overview of the Building Safety Act. I'm just going to echo a couple of things, just particular to competence, that I think is really important. Hal made a really big point of saying that the Building Safety Act, much of it is about all buildings. When it comes to competence, it's talking about competence for all buildings. Anybody who's contributing to the design and construction of all buildings. Anybody within that supply chain has a general requirement for competence. I think what is really important, the Building Safety Act, I mean, it is an enormous one, and I think whatever happens with the inquiry, whatever happens with that, we already have behind us a very enormous step forward, and essentially a government that is saying before or after the election, both of these governments have said to us in no uncertain terms, through the Building Safety Act and the building regulators, the Building Safety Regulator and the OPSF, that they mean business, essentially. You do not put this level of legislation and you do not put two new regulators in the picture without having an extremely great intent for more oversight and real change. That's what we're coming to. So I fear for people who aren't thinking about the topic of competence. And I fear for them because these are such enormous steps forward. There is so much work being put behind these subjects that actually, if you're not paying attention to them, it is akin to burying your head in the sand. And I think we are rapidly traveling towards a marketplace where if you can't demonstrate your competence, you can't be part of the marketplace. Now, we have seen a lot within the Building Safety Act that speaks about the competence of those who are contributing to buildings. And we are yet to see exactly what's going to come in secondary legislation with construction products. When it comes to manufacturing and testing of construction products, there isn't at the moment requirements within or explicit requirements, should I say, regarding the competence of those who are contributing. But I'm because the OPSS, which would be the new national regulator for construction products, has taken such an interest in the work that we've been doing on competence, I think it's very fair to say that that is on the horizon through one manner or the other. I'm sorry, I'm finding these slides a little bit challenging to control for some reason today. I want to talk a bit about what the Building Safety Act is saying specifically on competence. We've got Amendment 2A of the building regulations. And really, it makes explicit what I think was always a requirement. It does place new duties, but really to be able to reach a good demonstration of meeting the building regulations in the first place, I think it was always implicit, but now we've got this explicit requirement, and there were a few other fundamentals that are being drawn out. So we've got explicit requirements on the clients that they must demonstrate a competent workforce, that we've got for principal contractors, principal designers, principal accountable persons. They must all demonstrate both competence and make sure that they've got competent workforce. There's a general requirement on competence for everybody who's contributing to the design or build of buildings. And we've got competence itself defined as skill, knowledge, experience, and behaviour. And that is so critical. Behaviour is the critical part of this. I think we're very well understood of how we define skills, how we do knowledge. We need to get more sophisticated about how we're recording experience, I think. Behaviour, we need to really start thinking about how we go about recording those. But I think we can think of behaviour as any other skill. This is something that we need to be able to observe, we need to record it, and we need to have processes in place to improve it. And I think what Hal said is really, really key. Like, there needs to be leadership. There absolutely has to be leadership in making sure that behaviours, and essentially behaviours can be seen as a synonym for quality. We need to have that at an absolutely important, like right up there, right next to cost and time, as an essential factor of how we do business. We have requirements that individuals stop work when they reach their limit of competence, and organisations must demonstrate that they have individuals under their instruction do not work outside of this competence. So both the individual has to say no, and the organisation has to make sure that they are making that possible for individuals to say no. So we've got those two sides to that coin. I think, you know, we are in a that well-being is part of the topic of the day. And I don't mind sharing with many of you that when I worked on site before I joined CPA, I found it was very difficult to do a competent job balanced against doing having a reasonable mental health level of mental health. I think that's not an unfair thing to say. Either you did the job which was competent and you had to kind of work to such a level and work with lots of people who not necessarily driven to meet that level because it was hard to do that. Either you did that and you basically ran yourself into the ground, or you had an easier life and you looked after your mental health, and you went home at the end of the day, and maybe not everything in your intro was done, but at least you could go back and not have your brain falling out of your ear. I had 2 very serious mental health breakdowns while I was working on site. One of them took me off site for 6 months. And at the time, I thought that was just me. But I look back at the situations that I was put in, and that I saw other people put in. And time again, the people around me who were trying very hard to do a competent day's work were also the people who were having serious mental health problems. So there is something that needs shifting within the industry to make that it's a level playing field, that the people who are trying to do a competent work are supported, and those who aren't doing competent work are guided towards what that new expectation looks like, but also that there is space for people to do that competent work. Because actually, I think there's other priorities which just simply don't allow for it that easily. I'm really conscious of how much I've got to get through, but I had to take that moment when we were talking about mental health to just talk about that. So anyway, I'm just going to power through some of the next slides. I did want to speak about product liability a little bit. We don't know an enormous amount about what is coming down the road when it comes to the secondary legislation on construction products, but there is some hidden gems in the Building Safety Act. And as Hal said, the interesting thing about this part of it, when it comes to products, it has wider application than England. It's got UK application. So stuff about product liability, it does actually have an impact on competence. And it has an impact on competence right across the UK. And for more than, I think this is kind of an area where not many people know it, because it looks like it's just aimed at manufacturers. You'll see what I mean. Well, first and foremost, this is a great clause. It's identical in 148 and 149 with just like one specific difference between. I'll get to the difference, but they both say this. There's new liability applying to suppliers of construction products to be held accountable where products used in works causes or contributes to a dwelling being unfit for habitation. It's fantastic, because this is a liability that no longer, so previous to this, all liability for construction products sat pretty much between the person who was selling the product and the person who was procuring it. But the person who's procuring the construction product is very rarely the person who's going to be impacted by the construction product and how it performs. So it's really integral that here we've got a clause which brings in this liability for the safety of those who are using the products. So that's number one. That's really key. So it's fantastic that we've got this here. Liability applies to anyone failing to comply with a construction product requirement covering a construction product. Anyone marketing or supplying construction products making a misleading statement in relation to it, or anyone who manufactures a construction product which is defective. I think A and C is fairly, understandable. It's pretty clear. But anyone marketing or supplying a construction product, note that what they didn't say there was any manufacturer. They didn't say any merchant. They said anyone marketing or supplying a construction product. So when we get to this kind of language, it can be easily read that if you're specifying a construction product, if you're choosing a construction product, you're essentially supplying the construction product to the end user, because that's who this is aimed at. The end user is looking back at that supply chain. And if you're specifying a construction product, you're actually making a statement about its performance. You're saying that in this particular configuration, in this particular application or system, this will perform appropriately to this end. You're making a statement about its performance. So if it doesn't reach that performance, then we're essentially making a misleading statement about its performance. And if anybody within this process decides to swap out a product or use the product in a different way, you can quickly see how this not only starts impacting those who are manufacturers, merchants, distributors, but designers, specifiers, procurers, and sometimes those who are on site, installers, anybody who's managing, anybody who makes a different decision about how to use that product. They take on the design responsibility, design liability, and they're impacted by this clause. So the difference between 148 and 149 is literally just a type of product. 148 is in reference to general construction products. 149 is in reference to cladding construction products. And the liability is slightly different. So 148, there's liability placed on any project that was completed on or after the Building Safety Act was completed for 15 years thereafter. And the same is true for those for cladding products, but there's also 30 years retrospective liability for those projects that were completed before the laying of the Building Safety Act. So that's really important that everyone be aware of these liabilities that exist. So I'm not going to go through the key considerations. I really feel like Hal has really hammered home some of these things. I'm going to just say this. It is for all buildings. Competence is for all buildings. Everyone who's contributing to it. And if you're not covered by the legislation yet, trust and believe that you will be. I really do think that that's coming down the line. If not explicitly, it will be implicit in regulations regarding product performance. I will bet my cat on it. So, right. We've got a duty of competence for the entire supply chain. I just want to talk to you a bit about the Industry Competence Steering Group, really quickly. The ICSG, I'm sorry from Acronym City, but it exists. We are there to bring industry together to enable everyone in the UK in the built environment industry to be able to access appropriate competences that they may safely contribute to the creation and use of built environments and can demonstrate their competence to others. And of course, quite a lot of the work that we're doing is trying to respond to the Building Safety Act and other legislation across the UK. But where the legislation doesn't come up to the point of keeping people safe, the legislation isn't our focus. Keeping people safe is the focus of the competence work under the ICSG. Now, currently the ICSG brings together about 60 plus professional bodies and trade bodies from across the built environment. And there's about 1,500 people contributing to the programme. And I would love to show you the new structure, but we're yet to announce it. We're going to announce it on the 9th of December. So it's coming really soon. So I will talk a little bit about what we can expect to see, but I can't give you details. And we have Dan and Musa here who's going to be talking about the BSR, and I suspect the ICC as well. But just to show you where the ICSG lives in relationship to the ICC. We are there, we report into the ICC, but much of the work that the ICSG does is delivered through the sector-led groups that sit in there. Now, previously they were known as working groups, but now we're calling them sector-led groups. So this is the old structure of the Competence Steering Group, and we have the interim structure that we brought over, and I'm going to be really talking about the work of the previous sector-led group 12 on construction product competence. We've finally gotten there 7 minutes ago. Right. So the aim of that group was to create a solution that ensures all of those who are interacting with construction products are competent to do so and can demonstrate their competence to others. Now, I've got a lovely little definition of construction products there, because everybody always asks, when you're talking about construction products, what do you mean? Well, I can tell you it's practically anything that's delivered to market. If that's, it could be a singular construction product, it could be a kit, it can be a component, it could be a material, it could be a system. As long as you're putting it on market, declaring its performance as a construction product, that's it. The moment it goes over into design land and gets assembled, that's when it becomes an assembly of construction products, a building or built environment system, if you will. Okay, so the problem that we've got is that practically everyone across the supply chain uses or works with construction products or construction product information, and we know what the misuse of construction products can do. We've got horrible examples of what the misuse of construction products can do, and historically there's been no way to identify consistently across the board who is and who is not competent with construction products, which actually takes away a real opportunity to bring consistency across the board. Now, we have some wonderful standards in place. And, you know, I think given that this is a BSI presentation, it is very fitting if I take you through some of them. First, we had BSI Flex 8670. This was version 3. So now that is becoming that has become a full British standard. I'll come on to that in a minute. The aim of this standard was essentially the rules of the game if you're writing a competence framework and you're thinking about building safety. That's it. It's a glorified checklist. If you're writing a competence framework, and that could be training, it could be in-house training, it could be writing qualifications, it could be some work under the Industry Competence Steering Group where we come to a consensus of precisely what we believe training should be for a particular discipline or function or role, for example. If you're doing that, this is the rules of the game. Everybody should think, have I gone through this checklist? Does this apply to me? If it does, yes, then how am I responding to it? If it doesn't, well, that's fine, we'll put it to one side. So that's an important standard. Then we've got PAS 8671, 8672 and 8673. I'm sorry, it's actually coming up quite small on this little a screen now, but basically PAS 8671 is competence for individual principal designers, PAS 8672 is for principal contractors, and PAS 8673 is for those who are dealing with building safety management in residential buildings. So that's great, fantastic. Now, all of these standards, by the way, all of them say that you must be competent with construction products, and they also all say that you must be able to demonstrate a competent supply chain, but they don't tell you how. And that's why we have looked to put together a white paper for a proposed standard in construction product competence. So that, as I said, we've got BS 8670, that's now part 1, that's a full British standard. We're now in development of BS 8670 part 2, exactly the same as part 1. It's your checklist. Instead of just focusing on British building safety, we're thinking of construction products. And of course, because it's construction products, it's not limited to buildings. So it's for the entire built environment. And then also coming down the road, we've got BS 8674, which is competence for fire risk assessors, which that's just past public consultation, so we should be seeing that coming out. And also in the planning, we've got a standard that we're planning to put together for organisational capability, the management of competence, essentially. So that is the suite as we have it. I'm afraid, I'm really conscious that I'm running low on time, so I'm going to take you through precisely, I had to skip a slide, we're going to get to who is BS 8670 Part 2 aimed at. Anyone who's writing or managing or creating these competence frameworks, it's for if those frameworks for any individuals that are doing practically anything with construction products, as I say, right from designing and marketing the construction products all the way to the other end of the scale, owning, maintaining, decommissioning, for example. What I'm trying to get at here is a very holistic application. And we have put in 5 different levels of construction product competence within it. So at the very lowest level, E, you've got somebody who can be responsible for performing tasks with and about construction products under supervision, or relaying product information without interpretation. So like, say a construction product is Marmite. If you walk into a shop and you go to a very competent shop assistant, I would like some Marmite, that very competent shop assistant can say, here is a Marmite, I recognise a Marmite, this is what Marmite is. And then also, if you ask the ingredients, they could read it off of the back of the label, which is an authorised source, and they could do it without any interpretation, and you would know everything is good to go. If you're at level D, you can be responsible for proposing a construction product for a direct scope of application. So a direct scope of application is essentially a manufacturer has said that it can be used for this particular application in this particular way. It's demonstrated how it can do it. It gives you the testing information. That's a direct scope of application. So if I was D, I can propose within the direct scope of application. So I can walk into a shop and say to a shop assistant, I would like yeast spread for a sandwich. And the person in the shop would be competent to say, well, here is our selection of yeast spreads that are intended for sandwiches. However, I cannot select your yeast spread because I'm not competent to make sandwiches. So very competent at level D. C is where we first have the level of competence to be able to make a selection, but it is limited to a direct scope of application. So that's for products which we've got a proof of precisely how they can be used. They've got the appropriate demonstration behind it. But if you want to extend that scope of application, then you need to go up a level of competence to level B, because when you're extending that scope of application, you need to know how to mitigate those additional risks. Do you need to do more calculations? Do you have prior evidence? Do you need to go and do more testing? These are all questions, and you can only do that at level B. And then finally, level A is final responsibility for assessment, selection, being able to provide organizational rules and stuff. At level A, I just want to be clear, it's not necessarily somebody who's a director, it's a product expert. It's somebody who has that level of expertise in a product that they can do that final sign off of these important and risky things. Right, so I'm afraid I've really run out of time, so just to let you know that all of the levels, they cover very similar subjects. I'm sure that these slides will be made available to other people. But so at the end of this, what are we asking from you? Well, we're going to make an announcement on the new structure of the ICSG very soon. If you want to get involved in any of that, you can contact me, you can contact my co-chair, Jill Hancock, please do. If you can imagine there's a discipline out there under the built environment and you're interested in contributing to competence, I promise you we're covering it, get in contact. If you want to have a look at what this standard for BS 670 Part 2 is likely to look at, the white paper has still got lots of the principles. We're coming out for public consultation next year, early spring. So it says November 2024. No, it's next spring. So I suspect February or March. Please get ready to be able to contribute it, because the last thing we want is for that standard to not be highly practical for lots of people, so we need the intel. So but you've got loads and loads of clues within that white paper, and that's about it from me. Richard, I'm sorry I've gone a bit over.
Yeah, I think we gave you an almost impossible task, Hannah, and we said, why don't you talk about two massive things and we'll give you hardly any time to do it. I think that's just the nature of these events. I was going to say the same when I handed back to Ant later, is that people who are on this webinar and listening in or watching on demand afterwards should not think this is the end of the journey. I think your last slide and the one that's on the screen at the moment sort of covers that, to say, we're going to give you a very quick overview of what's going on and why you should care and what the point of it is to you and how you can get involved. But actually, I think the more important thing is for people to stay connected to all five of the speakers and I from BSI, to say, let's continue this conversation and stay involved with each other, so that then we can go into a bit more depth about it. But I really appreciate everything that you've covered. You did a fantastic job, as always, very knowledgeable, very interesting stuff. My thanks to you. And we shall come back to you in the panel session once Musa and Dan have covered their section. So don't worry about overrunning a few minutes. It's absolutely no problem at all. So we take a breath, and we have our friends and colleagues from the Building Safety Regulator. I say that, I hope they will appear, their faces will appear in a moment, I hope. There we go, there's Musa, hooray, fantastic stuff. Musa's there. What I'm going to do, Musa, is I'm going to read out your brief bio, and I will read out Dan's as well. Hi, Dan. Thank you very much for switching your camera on. Nice to see you. We will quickly read out a bio for you both, and then you can tag team as you go through your slides. You won't need to stop halfway through and introduce. You can just plow on through and get to the end. So Musa Awala is Senior Policy Advisor at the Health and Safety Executive, aka the Building Safety Regulator. Musa joined the Department of Levelling Up back when it was called DLUC in January 2019, and he's now the policy lead overseeing government authorised self-certification Competent Persons Scheme and their role in the building regulatory regime. Musa has over 15 years experience in working with standards in the construction sector, having previously been employed at BSI. We miss you, my friend. We miss you very much. Working in the development of construction product standards, as well as the Construction Industry Council and the Construction Sector Skills Council, to develop occupational standards for a range of professions and trades in the built environment sector. Wonderful, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Daniel Barracliff is the Industry Competence Policy Lead for the BSR. His work is focused on understanding how the building safety regulator can facilitate and improve competence in the built environment industry, supports the newly formed Industry Competence Committee, which we've heard of and we'll hear again from. Prior to joining BSR, he worked on HSE's Science Division, leading research projects on asbestos management and removal. Wow, fabulous. We really appreciate you joining us this morning, guys. We shall hear less from me and more from you. Over to you, Musa. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think Dan's going to get started.
Dan's going to go first.
Thank you, Dev.
Right. Thanks, Ian, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks to BSI for inviting us along today. We're always keen to come along to these things and talk about competence because it's a very important topic. Now, hopefully, I'm going to make Ian's time management duties a bit easier because I'm going to reinforce some of the points that Hannah made. I think it's important I do reinforce them rather than, but I can possibly go through them a bit quicker and give Musa some time to speak in detail about the competent person schemes and other things. But anyway, to start off with, as Hannah mentioned previously, there were amendments to building regulations that came into force last October 2023. And I've had some version of this slide since then, and even before then, actually, because when the legislation was being drafted. But I still hear a lot that people either aren't aware of this or speaking to others that they don't think that there's great industry recognition, awareness of these changes to building regulations. So I'm going to reinforce the point that Hannah made earlier. These amendments were made. They placed duties on all contractors and designers to plan, manage, and coordinate work to ensure to make sure there's compliance with building regs. And this comes from, in part, from the Grenfell inquiry, when people were put on the stand and they were asked, how did you make sure your work complied with building regulations? And pretty much everyone said, oh, it wasn't my responsibility. That was X person's responsibility. And sort of passed the buck. And when they got on the stand, that person, they said something similar. So it's now clear and explicit in regulations that everyone has that duty. And obviously that will sit at different levels in terms of your responsibility within an organisation, but there is still a legal duty for everyone. These amendments also included the competence requirements for all people carrying out design and build work, as previously mentioned. This is defined in the regulations as having the right skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. And then there's requirements for organisation to have the right organisational capability to carry out work, and that's defined as having in place the right systems, policies, and procedures to manage work and compliance. So there's duties there both on individuals and organisations, and there's something in there about anyone who's in training needs to be supervised. And I think a point Hannah made before is quite right. It doesn't mean that we didn't think these things should have been happening before. Competent people should have been doing work and should have been demonstrating their competence. But findings from the Grenfell inquiry, findings from Dame Judith Hackett's independent review said this wasn't happening, and we needed to be more explicit about it in regulations. So that's what's come in. Next slide, please. And just to speak a little bit on BSR's competence remits. So I think one of the topics that's been talked about before is that this is not just about HRBs. So the Building Safety Act gave us as a regulator a duty to facilitate an improvement of competence. Some of the policy work I lead on, and it's facilitate an improvement of competence across the built environment. And the built environment in the Building Safety Act is defined as all activities relating to design, construction, management, and maintenance of buildings. And we want to see an improvement across the life cycle of the building, and also across the whole supply chain. Now, there's some elements there, Hannah's touched on them, in terms of competence relating to construction products, which don't come under our remit, but will come under the remit of construction product regulation. And we will work quite closely, whether it's with a construction product regulator or whether it ends up being one single regulator, whatever that framework is, and that's been discussed a bit before by Hal. Whatever that regulatory framework is, we will work to make sure there's an improvement of competence across the supply chain. And importantly, we have some important duties around the competence of building control professionals. There's now a register. They had to demonstrate their competence through assessment schemes that we approved. So our role is to facilitate industry action. And then in HRBs, we are obviously the building control body now, and we will enforce against them where we need to. Next slide, please. Another quick thing I want to focus on and reinforce from previous presenters is around behaviours in culture. So yes, the definition of competence and regulation includes behaviours. As has been mentioned, there's specific behaviour mentioned in regulations about recognising the limits of your competence and not working beyond that. And this again comes from sort of findings from previous reviews and inquiries that people can have the right competence, to demonstrate their competence against recognized technical standards, but don't necessarily then carry that out, through into their work. And so they felt there was a need to sort of bring in some more explicit reference to behaviours and culture. And I think the other important thing to note here is that yes, there is a duty on individuals, but for individuals to sort of be able to feel empowered to sort of demonstrate the right behaviours, to be able to put their hand up and say, I don't think I'm competent for this, they need to be working within the right organisational culture. One can't happen without the other. So that's really important. Some of these quotes on the slide come from some previous research HSE did in this area in relation to health and safety culture. I think they're relevant for what we're talking about here, though. If we move on to the next slide. So I want to focus on two roles that have been mentioned before, but are quite important: principal designer and principal contractor. So these are new roles that were also introduced in building regulation amendments. They share their titles with those who are familiar with the construction design management regulations. They carry out some of the same functions in terms of plan, managing, coordinating, but they are different roles, legally distinct, and they are about managing compliance with building regulations and building safety rather than health and safety legislation. So they will require different competence demonstration and slightly different set of skills. And these roles, these people or organisations that take them on, have overarching responsibility for managing building regulations compliance, whether it's compliance relating to design work or compliance relating to building work. And I want to reinforce the point again that though these roles might have the overarching responsibility for compliance, back to my previous point, in regulations, everyone still has a duty to manage their work. So there is that compliance and safety. I think it's really important that people understand and think about what these roles involve. I will share, I'll ask BSI to share after this presentation some guidance and some gov.uk that sets out what the duties of these roles are. And I think it's important people read that and also think a little bit about how it applies to their work. These duties and these roles apply across all building work in England because obviously they're in building regulations. And a slightly different set of skills will be required, slightly different set of competence will be required if you're, say, plan managing, coordinating work on a small refurbishment versus, say, construction of a HRB. But there are some similar sets of skills that run through both. The BSI documents there on the slides, the publicly available specifications set out the competence requirements for these roles. I think they're also good reading material that helps you understand what carrying out those roles will involve. What we want to see in terms of a consistent approach across industry in terms of competence demonstration for these roles is that industry schemes that are set up to assess people's competence should be in alignment with those standards. We have begun to see schemes set up, but we'd like to see more uptake of them. And we may look to see and sort of evolve over time what the minimum requirements are for those schemes to make sure that they are setting that consistent benchmark. We may also evolve over time our requirements as a building control body for HRBs. People have to, clients have to give evidence of the competence of the people that they are appointing to these roles during building control applications. The evidence we require there may ramp up over time. The regulations are new. We allow at the moment a certain level of self-declaration against these benchmarks. Those requirements are likely to change over time. We want to see consistent improvement over time. We understand that that change takes time, but it does need to happen. Yeah, and I've covered a bit before. Contractors carrying out all types of work must consider their competence for these roles across all buildings. If we move on to the next slide, just to finish on some key messages. It's really important that looking at these requirements, organisations think about the training, development, and assessment procedures they have in place. I want to say that it's not just about putting people on training courses. Competence is a wider thing than that, and it's a continuous process. But training people, understanding what training they have is important. Understanding what people's development looks like in a sort of consistent way. Hal touched on this earlier, and maybe this isn't happening as it should be at the moment. And also that idea of assessing people, making sure you understand what their current level of competence is and what it needs to be. We also, I mentioned in terms of before around culture, we want to see an improvement in the culture of organisations recognising that they need to understand that the culture around making sure people understands that it's about building safe buildings and making sure that people are able to demonstrate the right behaviours during their work. I think the next steps for industry and also in BSR and trying to facilitate that is sort of continuing industry collaboration. Hannah mentioned the Industry Competence Steering Group. We do really encourage engagement with that. So we got that sort of consistent collaborative industry benchmarks on competence, and we encourage that collaborative kind of behaviour generally across industry between professional bodies. It's really important that people are talking to each other, and so that we see an uptake of frameworks and a consistent approach. Musa will speak in a bit about the sort of consistent approach we're looking for competent person schemes. So I'll finish there and I'll hand over to Musa.
Thanks, Dan. Next slide, please. So even though previous speakers have talked to, if you like, the legislative framework, I think it's a useful reminder, given the context of the conversation we're going to have about the role of self-certification competent person schemes in the sector. So at the top, you'll see there's a reference to the Building Act and the Building Safety Act. They set the framework for the system. The building regulations in Schedule 1 set the technical requirements that must be met for building work as defined in Regulation 3. And there are a number of procedural requirements that are needed to be considered for building work as defined under Regulation 3. And that includes Regulation 20, which covers the work of members of competent person schemes as defined in Schedule 3 to the building regulations. So it's an important reference point, if you like, for understanding the key actors and the key players in the system. The approved documents provide statutory guidance on how to comply with the functional requirements. And the team that I'm a part of hold the pen on the approved documents. And that's a reflection of the Section 5 duty, Section 5 of the Building Safety Act, about keeping the safety standards under review. And, they're a really important suite of documents that I think may be, if you like, under-referenced or underutilized in the sector, but clearly subject to the conversation that's been had in the building safety regulator following on from the announcement on the 2nd of December about the review or end-to-end review of approved documents. This is going to come to more prominence, how we design, set out and publish guidance to meet the functional requirements of building regs in future. So I'm happy to come back on another occasion and talk through that wider AD review. And then we have standards, national and international, that set out the detailed specifications that are often referenced in the approved documents. Previous speakers can wax lyrical on this. I think there are approximately 600 British standards, international standards, industry codes referenced in the entire suite of the approved documents. So it's a really important feature, if you like, of setting guidance for the sector. And it's something that will be revisited, I think, in future. Next slide, please. So the CPS system is the self-certification competent person scheme system. I think it's important to refer to the self-certification element here, because the working assumption might be that all competent persons have to be members of the current 15 competent person schemes as listed in Schedule 3 of the Building Regulations. But it's an important reference to their ability or their competence to self-certify that the work that they carry out, which is notifiable under the building regulations, meets the applicable functional requirements of the regulations. So you'll see a list of types of work in column 1 of Schedule 3 of the building regulations, and that largely covers the fabric, building fabric and building services, trades and professions. And those are the types of work that we're talking about here that are applicable to the self-certification CPS system. The process removes the need to seek building control or building regs approval from a building control service before work starts. It's a key element, if you like, in providing assurance to the widest possible audience that those individuals and organizations who are members of these schemes have been assessed as being competent to do so. And that removes the need to submit a building notice and pay for the fees to do so, which can be quite considerable. The principle here is that anybody operating as an approved or certified business within a competent person scheme has a duty to comply with all the aspects of the building regs. So building regs compliance is at the heart of the self-certification CPS system. Next slide, please. How is this achieved? Well, the schemes are effectively in line with the government's conditions of authorizations, obliged to implement a common assessment procedure, right, to carry out the assessment of the competence of their members. And that includes on-site surveillance and checking and inspecting of work. So the principle here is that those elements mitigate the risk of rogue traders or rogue operators operating within the CPS system, but also provide assurance to consumers and homeowners. So if you're seeking a distress replacement of a boiler, for example, or a heating system, and you call up a member of a competent person scheme, then effectively the contractor who comes out to carry out the work can do so. You can be safe in the knowledge that they can do so and have been assessed as competent to do so, and can do so without needing to submit a building notice prior to work commencing. Now, the principle here about what constitutes the assessment procedure, they used to be called minimum technical competencies, and now we've gone through something of a rebrand over the last few years, looking at all of the competency criteria that must be met across the types of work under Schedule 3. A number of these competency matrices derive back to qualifications and national occupational standards that were derived by sector skills councils, particularly Summit Skills on the building services side. And the closure of Summit Skills necessitated a conversation prior to the Grenfell Tower tragedy about carrying out a review of the MTCs, but post the Grenfell Tower tragedy and in light of the section covering competence in the Hackett independent review of the building regulatory system, conversations took a pace at looking at the entire suite of the competency criteria across all the trades and sectors. And it's been a journey, but we are close to finalizing those MTCs. So it's a matter of probably coming back at a time when we're ready to publish those MTCs that we can go into further detail about the context of the work. Next slide, please. Well, this gives you an overview of where we were. We set up 10 task groups, largely comprised of the schemes who are government authorized self-certification schemes. We engaged with other government-enabled scheme owners like the Microgeneration Certification Scheme and Trustmark on both the, if you like, eco and bus sides of the equation. We engaged with trade associations, we engaged with professional bodies, and we also engaged with other government departments in setting out what the criteria should be for, or the benchmark should be for the MTCs, where regulated qualifications or UCAS accredited personnel certification are used as evidence of competence. then the CPS operator must ensure that the qualification is mapped to the sector-specific MTCs. We're dealing with a workforce here that largely have no formal qualifications. So the MTC assessment procedure is a really important element of how you assess the competence of these individuals and organizations who are largely micros and sole traders, and SMEs. The challenge has always been they're a hard to reach group, but in this respect, given that they are government authorized schemes, there is that mechanism to engage with them and have the conversation about what constitutes competence in this space. And that feeds back into Dan and Hannah's presentations. Yeah, so a consistent approach to the assessment of competence. So the task groups have been working on drafting these competency criteria for the last few years, and I bear all the scars. And this includes carrying out work in higher risk buildings. Yeah, so we're talking about electrical contractors, gas engineers. We're talking also about insulation contractors and glazers. Yeah. So across the board, there's been a coalescence, if you like, as to what constitutes, or a consensus as to what constitutes competence. And these conversations have evolved since the publication of the final report and the independent review, through the work of the CSG and the raising the bar and setting the bar publications, and now with the formation of the ICC and ICSG. We've engaged with IFA, who are now operating a Skills England in shadow form. There's a real conversation happening as well around workforce capacity and skills across the trades, across the sectors. So that's an important part of how we take this work forward and implement these new competency criteria, if you like, matrices. The challenge is not just about setting the standards, it's about implementing those standards. So it's in two parts here, so we've got to be conscious of that. So we have been talking to IFA Skills England, clearly ICSG, ICC, the Construction Leadership Council, and a range of professional institutions and trade bodies. So the work is motoring on. And the last point there is an important point. In the BSR strategic plan, there's a commitment to be responsible for maintaining, not just publishing, but maintaining these competencies for installers operating under competent person schemes, and that's something that's going to be an ongoing, if you like, periodic review in terms of accuracy and the currency of these competency criteria. Next slide, please. So the conditions of authorization, I referenced this earlier. They're the rules, so to speak, and the framework within which the schemes have to operate in. There are 21 criteria, and they cover registration and renewal of members, conflicts of interest, financial probity, sharing of information and data, carrying out assessments, governance, and other related aspects, organizational capability, technical assessor base, etc. They require scheme operators to assess members against the MTCs, that's condition 9 and condition 12, and the requirements of the building regs and guidance contained were included within the approved documents to the building regulations. So there's a working assumption as and when we update and change the requirements and the regulations and update the guidance contained within the approved documents, that the approach to assessing the competence of their members is reviewed, revalidated, reassessed. Scheme operators are required to define areas of expertise and common competencies and ensure a consistent approach to registration for applicants. So that's across the board. So we've got, the plumbing contractors, we've got the electrical contractors, we've got the gas engineers, clearly under the gas safety and use regs and the gas safe register. It's unique amongst the self-certification, if you like, competent person schemes, but these methods and these approaches, just like the conditions of authorization, have to have a common element to them, to ensure that kind of level playing field. The scope of the review, which is another feature of the Building Safety Regulator Strategic Plan, is to carry out a review of the condition of authorization to ensure they're fit for purpose. Well, we've got to consider the changes to the regulations. We've just had a really detailed set of presentations about the introduction of the Building Safety Act in April 2022, the changes to the building regs that were introduced in October 2023, and what that means. The importance of data being collected for notifiable work, particularly for work carried out in higher risk buildings. Howell talked earlier about the golden thread of information and building safety information being a key factor here. And the appropriate nature of financial protection mechanisms for consumers. Increasingly, we're seeing reports from the Citizens Advice Bureau, the CMA, and others around the theme of consumer protection. And a lot of the scope of these contractors and their work is around the replacement of a controlled service or a control fitting, the replacement of a window or a door, or the replacement of a heating system or a plumbing system. And a lot of this work is really carried out through government-enabled schemes, and we need to have a conversation about the alignment of standards and what constitutes competence across these schemes, and particularly the offering to consumers. Yeah. And so that's something that we've engaged with over the last year since moving over from the department, which is the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government, to the BSR. And I think we're seeing a lot more information come to light about the need for a conversation about this very topic, considering that there's north of 3.5 million jobs being carried out by 180,000 registered businesses. So the scale of this is pretty significant if something goes wrong. Yeah. And I think that's the last slide.
It is. Perfect. You packed a lot into that. So thank you both for covering, as with Hannah's presentation, a lot of stuff at a level that hopefully gives some insight to the attendees on everything we covered. So we've just got time, a few minutes at the end. We've obviously, as you can imagine, had a lot of questions asked, but we probably won't be able to cover all of them. But just a few of them, I think, maybe Dan, picking up on your point about the seriousness of this and that it's a legal duty. There was a question. There was a couple that related to CDM, and the sort of overlap with building regulations. So the question was along the line of, what are the sanctions against those claiming to be competent to undertake the principal design of building regs role when they are only CDM trained? Do you want to kick us off on that one if you're able to?
Yeah, no, happy to. And yeah, and I mean, I suppose the point I made in my presentation, the best place to start is that they are legally distinct roles. They require different competencies. And I've shared some of the BSI documents that sets out some of the competence requirements for that role under building regulations. So given that it's in regulations, if someone is trying to demonstrate their competence just using their competence to CDM, it's very likely, almost certain, that they are in breach of those regulations. In terms of what the sanctions might be, I mean, first off, I'll speak from a BSR perspective as a building control body, because there's one key one there to begin with, which is that if someone submitted a building control application, a client did, and they said, this person has demonstrated to me their competence through, because they're competent for the CDM role, and that's all the evidence they've given me, the building control application wouldn't be approved. It would be rejected. Construction wouldn't be able to work, wouldn't be able to start. And the client would have to go back and either appoint someone else or, most likely in that situation, because it's unlikely someone will be able to build up their competence in a quick enough time, unless it was a case of just supplying the wrong evidence. But yeah, so I mean, that's a clear sanction in terms of building control applications on HRBs. More generally, across all buildings, obviously building control bodies will have different ways of looking at compliance and different ways of different enforcement policies. And the available options to them, maybe they can give, because it is a breach, and if they investigate it and they see that, they could give a compliance notice which says you must take steps to improve this. If they think it's serious enough, they give a stop notice and say you must stop work. If there's a severe level of risk beyond that, they may even look at prosecution, and the building control body and the registered competent RBI, registered building inspector, will make a judgment based on risk, different factors involved, and that kind of thing as to what action they'll take. I'm going to flick back a little actually to the CDM role, because HSC has an experience here regulating in that space, and we have prosecuted principal designers and principal contractors under CDM. Where we think they've carried out their work in a way that breaches regulations and puts people's lives at risk or people's health at risk. And as part of that evidence for those prosecutions, we will use lack of competence as evidence, and the That's another, adds to the weight of evidence, adds to the breach, and leads to bigger fines and so forth. And there's no reason that principle won't carry across to our regulation, to our enforcement on building regulations. So.
Yeah, I appreciate I mean, there was funnily enough, it must resonate because there was a similar one along the lines of what are the distinct differences of duty holders for building regulations compared to CDM, and I presume that's basically the answer you've just given.
Yeah, I mean, it's the fact that they carry out, plan managing and coordinating is the principle across the both, but it's, for one, it's about compliance with health and safety, and for one, it's about compliance with building regulations. And in order to understand whether a project is compliant with building regulations, you need to have a level of understanding of them, a level of understanding of who you might need to consult to comply with them, and so yeah, there will be some key differences between the two.
Brilliant. Hannah, so I don't know if you have anything you wish to add to Dan's very detailed answer to that. You're welcome to chuck in some thoughts if you wish, or we can move to another question if you would prefer. Any thoughts on that one, or are you happy?
I thought I might just add into the mix
that,
if you wouldn't mind, and I think Danny's right to kind of go, what happens with the new works, but I think as we go further onto this, if there are evidence that projects have gone wrong after the fact of building control, and if it's retrospectively found that there was inappropriate competence, I think when prosecution happens, if you can't demonstrate competence, then some of these criminal penalties will kick in potentially. And I wondered if Dan, if my interpretation of this is correct.
Yes, there is the potential for that. Again, I mean, without going into specifics, it depends on the level of risk. I mean, if we're looking at a situation where after investigation and it's quite clear some serious material breaches of building regulations that have led to potential risks to life in the future, then yeah, you are going to start looking at prosecutions. And competence will be a factor in if you're. It's gonna add to your problems if not only you've built a non-compliant building, but you weren't competent in the first place and have no way of demonstrating it, because that's another breach.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you both for that. I think this sort of takes us into a topic that's come up quite a lot, and I think Hal mentioned it earlier in his presentation. When we're talking about the sort of the magnitude of things and tasks that organizations and individuals are trying to deal with. So the question was relating to how clients can support the whole supply chain, especially smaller contractors and consultants, to adapt to change. So the idea is that we want to reduce bureaucracy, improve climate action, improve safety and quality, and reduce cost. Lots on that plate. What gets compromised? But I suppose, the question says what gets compromised. Those are not my words. But also, maybe how do we deal with that magnitude of challenge and make sure that we can effectively address each of them? Hannah, do you want to kick us off on your thoughts on that question, if you don't mind?
I've got some thoughts. I think there's got to be something recognised here about what has been the previous approach to when clients have gotten projects. I think there needs to be a recognition that the previous costs of projects was for projects that were under-resourced, incompetent, where quality wasn't at the appropriate level. I think there's need to be a realism point here, that for us to do an improvement in quality, like anything else, you get what you pay for. So realistically, initially, I think we'll see for people to be appropriately competent, costs will rise. Now, I think in the long term, we'll see a levelling out, because with those competencies will come efficiencies. And I think that all of this is pointing to a far more efficient and effective industry. But I think that clients need to pay real attention to what kind of contracts they're laying out and what they are requiring of their supply chain. So number one, does that contract give space for the supply chain to be able to create space for competence and quality within it and go for these targets? What are the lead-in times? What is the procurement model? All of those things have an enormous impact. So engagement with clients and engagement with other facilitators in this arena, such as I suspect insurers, which is definitely one which we need to have a close relationship to, It's absolutely intrinsic, because with the best will in the world, somebody at the bottom of a supply chain is unable to contribute competence if they've not been given the environment to do so. And if they've been forced to come at the lowest cost, at the lowest time, and have been given almost no time to be able to process that information or resource what they need to contribute, then we are setting them up for failure. So I think that's a very important part of the picture.
Yeah, excellent answer. I really appreciate that. That's a very good way of putting it. And Musa, you are unmuted, so I am thinking you may have some thoughts on this point too, if you're able to share. He may be unmuted, but we can't hear him, which is a little bit of a conundrum.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want me to rescue you, Musa?
Could you hear me?
Yeah,
Could you hear me now?
All right. Yeah, we've got you.
That was a
Thank
problem
you.
with my laptop.
Fire away, my friend.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Hannah was just saying there. I mean, from our perspectives, perhaps this perception of being these things being mutually exclusive are a problem. But I think the duty, if you like, for the client principally is to ensure that suitable arrangements are in place to plan, manage, and monitor the project, and that means appointing the right people with the right competencies for the work, getting sufficient time to the project, and establishing systems to ensure compliance with the requirements of the regulations. So that's at the heart of what we're talking here, and I do feel like this probably connects to a wider message, a wider kind of question about messaging and comms. And it is, these are the most significant changes in the last 3-4 decades to the system, to the regulatory regime. So it's really about how this message lands, not just with the tier ones, but right down to the subbies, and the one-man band, so to speak.
Yeah, spot on. Dan, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, or it can lead us into
Just
the final question.
reinforce the point of the others. I do understand the problem that the questioner is getting at there, but we will reject the framing a little bit in terms of there needing to be compromise. We want to see, it's going to be difficult, but we want to see a change in culture, and the clients need to set the tone.
Yeah.
Also, we need to do some engaging work to help with that, but they have the duties that Musa mentioned there now, clearly in building regulations to ensure that they provide the right resources to projects.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And the fight, we've probably just got moments left for one last question, which I think is really important to tie everything that we've talked about today, and going back to that point of this not being the end of a journey just from speaking to the 7 of us who have presented this morning. But going back to your industry collaboration point you made, Dan, the question here is, there seem to be lots of bodies pushing with sometimes their own agenda, but who do we listen to? Ironically, we need a single source of truth. And Hannah, we may have had this conversation through ICSG and BSR about sort of that comms bit that Musa was mentioning. Is there some advice we can give on the fact that actually that's something that people are very well aware of, and we want to try and tackle? Do you want to just give a final thought on that concept of engagement and comms?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Industry Competence Steering Group, we're going to make an announcement along with the Industry Competence Committee about our structure and our place to play in this whole environment. What is the role that we play? We're going to be making that announcement next week. Part of that, I think it's a part of that announcement is going to say this collaboration between the ICSG and the building BSI, and that we are looking to put together a communications hub for competence. Yeah. And I know that the ICC is going to be pushing out their communications as well, but what we're looking to do is everything that's covered of the ICSG, all the competence frameworks, all of the advice that is given out to help create those environments for competence as well that we're going to be pushing out. It's going to be available there. We'll also be looking to be linking across to any appropriate, so we'll be linking towards, of course, all of the standards. We'll be linking towards all of ICCs because we're very much of the same message. We are a working group of the ICC, but we'll be pointing you to them, to the legislation that's appropriate. So hopefully what we are going to get ourselves to a place where we do have a single source of the truth. That's the aim.
Yeah, well put. And Dan, I don't know if you have anything to add from your side. I mean, like we said, we've talked a lot about the challenge of how much information is out there and the guidance that people clearly need. Do you have any thoughts on helping with that?
I mean, I would encourage people, to get involved with the industry competence steering group, and I think over the coming months and beyond, we're going to try and get more consistent in our messaging on competence, so that it is more aligned and people do know where to look. That's an ongoing process because we need a lot of that work from industry to happen, so we can point to those industry benchmarks that have been created through a collaborative process. But yeah, we're working more on that, and more generally, I think it's a difficult one. That we talk about organisational culture. There needs to be a more collaborative culture across industry, so professional bodies trying to talk to each other more rather than competing with each other. And I know that's probably significant change for some, but we do need to see it.
Yeah, and I think the fact the question was asked with that language, I think completely echoes what you're saying. Musa, any final thoughts from you before we hand back to Ant?
I think this is something that we need to really be open to collaborating on across the board. Really, we're talking to organisations that have sole traders, SMEs, micros within their footprint who may not be familiar with the approved documents, may not be familiar with the building regulations requirements, and changes to both. So I think on a consistent basis as to what we set as a benchmark, there needs to be common messaging across the board about what good looks like, I feel.
Great place to finish. Thank you all so much. You are wonderful people. I appreciate you giving up your time and all the insight. Thank you to everybody for listening to us. And we will hand back to you, and hopefully not too far over the end time.
Absolutely not. Fantastic session, Ian, Hannah, Dan, and Musa. Can't believe it's so long ago that you left me, Musa. Thank you for that detailed take through on all things competency based. I think it's not very often we enter a realm where actually we realise how badly we'd gotten it wrong and how much we were missing. But to watch how the machine and the industry have come together and mobilised with a suite of deeply impressive standards and additional guidance provided therein, not just BSI, and what more we've got to do, I think it's first rate and much needed. That brings this morning's session effectively to a close. Of course, I wish to just remind people that are still with us that we do have an afternoon session looking at the Information Management Initiative, overseen and supported by NEMA, and we want to talk about the UK BIM framework as well. That'll be led by mine and Ian's colleague, Darren Rossiter, starting this afternoon. The link is there, but just go onto the website and sign up if you haven't done so already. It would be great to see you there. Other than that, it's all I have left to say is thank you. Of course, I'd like to express our thanks to all of our great speakers today. You've been brilliant. I know how busy you are. I know how much in demand you are, but thank you for making the time to come and join us today in this session. I would like to thank all of you, of course, who have joined our session this morning as well, and hopefully this afternoon too. As Hal mentioned earlier, we can't do what we do as your national standards body without you. And so if you have an interest in getting more involved in standards making, or if you have an idea of where new standards can help our sector, then we really want to hear from you. And finally, I just want to say a really big thank you to our events team for making this all happen. You might not see it, but this is a new platform, an improved platform for GoToWebinar, and it's a dream to use compared to where it used to be. So a big thank you to the team too. So that's it. That's us done. Thank you for joining us, and I wish you well for a great Christmas and New Year. But don't forget to join this afternoon too. Take care, everybody, and thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.